I feel like I should address the fact that I've got a blanket on. It's because I'm cold and there's no heating. The Wasp Factory by Mr. Iain Banks is an alright book. So you may recognise Iain Banks as the fellow who also wrote Walking on Glass, which is actually the book that inspired me to start reviewing books in the first place because I had a lot of thoughts about that one. This one is interesting because while it fixed a lot of the issues I had with Walking on Glass, it still fell into some of the same traps. But weirdly, this feels like it was sort of written later, but actually it was the first novel he published, so I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, it's about a teenager called Frank who lives sort of off the grid. His dad used to be like a hippie and didn't register his birth, so Frank doesn't technically exist. They live on an island in Scotland where Frank is basically free to do whatever he likes because he's homeschooled. We know immediately that he's a bit odd and probably has psychopathic tendencies, as the book begins with him checking on his sacrifice poles, which are sticks carrying the heads and bodies of various dead animals. He uses these to attract birds, and then so when someone approaches the island, the birds will fly away, thus alerting Frank that someone's approaching because we can't be caught unawares. He also has something called the Wasp Factory, but we don't hear much about that until a fair way into the book, so I won't go into it. The book starts with the policeman revealing to Frank's father that Frank's brother, who I think is named Eric, but I honestly can't remember, has escaped from a psychiatric institution and is likely making his way back to the island. And so most of the novel follows Frank preparing for Eric's return. So overall, I did like the book. So let's go into why. Despite nothing much technically happening during the course of the book, it still managed to be quite gripping with the way it slowly unfolded the main character, Frank's past. We find out very early on, as in the blurb, that he's already killed 3 people before the age of 10. And it is quite exciting finding out who he killed, why he killed them, and how, because they're all in quite strange and unusual ways. I think Neil Gaiman actually reviewed this, saying they were very beautiful deaths. I don't think they're beautiful, but they're interesting. But if you actually look purely at the events that happen sort of presently, I suppose, all that Frank really does is he like murders some wasps, gets drunk at the pub, and then answers the phone a bunch of times until the last few chapters, and then it goes mad. The way that mental health and illnesses are spoken about is quite interesting. I can't sit here and say it was done perfectly, because I honestly don't know enough about the subject to really comment. But I would say it's handled better in this than in Walking on Glass, where it felt quite stereotypical and cliched. Frank, as a main character, is a lot more interesting to learn about than Stephen Grout, who was the one from Walking on Glass. They had different illnesses and problems, obviously. Frank is sort of more psychopathic, whereas Stephen more suffered paranoia. But I thought Frank was handled better. I also really enjoyed the strange gothic and otherworldly feel and otherworldly elements that were written in this book and how they were explored by Banks. So he approaches more as a sci-fi book. I think he said that the island was like another planet and Frank was a bit like an alien. So that was quite an interesting approach. The way that Frank interacts and sees the world was quite interesting, with his thoughts of revenge and balance mixing and becoming almost shamanistic was the word used on Wikipedia. And he had these sort of like rituals and these methods of divination, and they're all like insane, but I actually really enjoyed reading about them, which was odd considering a lot of them include like cruelty to animals, which usually I cannot stand. But Banks wrote it in a way that I was able to stomach it. Also, he wasn't hurting cats, and it's cats that sort of set me off. So if you really like rabbits, you probably won't have a good time with this. I'll just say that now. There were apparently complaints when this first came out in, I think, 1984, about the gruesome depiction of violence. But I didn't think it was actually that bad. There were some key moments, I suppose, which were quite grim and I guess were graphic. But for the most part, Banks doesn't really describe them in too much detail until he actually needs to. He picks his moments well. You don't get used to the violence and the disgusting scenes. So when he wants you to have a reaction, you have a reaction because he does describe them a lot more viscerally, I suppose. So I think the people of 84 were just like wimps because it's not that bad. I thought tension and intrigue were built up very well. So the first thing that stood out was the build-up to Eric's return, which was done mostly through these insane phone calls that Frank receives from his brother periodically throughout the novel. And you find yourself both wanting to hear more about Eric and to sort of see him finally turn up, but you were also quite concerned about that happening as well. And because he always phoned the landline, because it was in the 80s, you were never quite sure if Frank's dad was going to pick up instead, so that was also quite tense. And the other thing that was built up to was Frank's dad's study, which was always locked, and Frank thinks about it, like, all the time. But he's never allowed inside, so the reader also kind of, it builds up an anticipation, because you think, well, we're going to go into that study eventually. And you really want to know what's inside it, so when you do finally get inside, it's really exciting. And you're constantly wondering what could be inside that will affect Frank and his life and his relationships, because you know it's got to be something big. So I thought that was actually very well. But I did have a couple of issues. Although I thought the depiction of mental health was mostly alright with Frank, although I will give some more thoughts about that later, I did a little bit at Eric's issues, as the narrative seems to imply that he was completely normal until this one event, and then he just went insane. Which the closest thing it sort of is like PTSD, but it just didn't ring true to me, so that felt a little bit caricaturish, but I don't know, so... My only other real issue was with the ending and how that sort of affected everything else. So let's move swiftly into some lovely spoilers. As you can imagine, the climax is about the two things that had been built up to, the locked study and Eric's return. Small trigger warning, I will be discussing some pretty nasty things and touch on some possibly sort of transgender related topics, so just so it doesn't come out in left field for anyone. Anyway, it's revealed that Eric was training in like medicinal practices and stuff, but he went insane whilst working at a hospital where he was helping with children who were in a really, really bad state. There was one child who was halfway to a vegetable, like couldn't really do much, and his brain hadn't the skull wasn't full or something, so he had like metal plates to kind of like hold his skull together and like keep his brain contained. I don't know, it's kind of grim. And then one day he's feeding the child and the child just isn't reacting. Usually the child would like react to food, but it's just smiling vacantly. And he, I think, realizes that the metal plate isn't sitting correctly. So he like looks in and he finds maggots literally eating the child's brain alive, which is horrifying. And that just sends him insane. He goes back home and he starts trying to like feed dirt and maggots to children and then starts burning people's pet dogs. So that was just a bit sort of sudden, and it just felt really random. It didn't seem built up to very well, and it didn't seem right with the sort of mental illness side of things. I could be wrong, but it didn't seem right. And I don't really get why seeing maggots eat a child's brain, as horrifying as it is, would make you hate dogs with a burning passion. So anyway, at the end of the book, he comes home, tries to burn down the house with these like bombs or something that were underneath. It was explained. Fails, and then he had a little nap on Frank's lap, which was a little underwhelming, and that's literally how the book ends. He had a little sleep, and Frank's just sitting there thinking about life. Anyway, the other climax was more interesting. Frank gets into the office and finds some lady products and a jar of pickled male genitalia. He realises it's his genitalia, owing to an incident in his childhood during his younger brother's birth. The incident involved their dog attacking him and biting off his baby bits. The dad then killed the dog and opened it up and found the baby bits and apparently kept them in a jar. But the lady products, which are like tampons and stuff, throw Frank. He doesn't know how to react to them. He assumes it's because his dad is actually his mum. and had made up the whole hippie thing and the mum. So he goes to confront the dad, but actually the dad is dad and, you know, isn't a woman. And then the truth comes out that actually Frank is biologically female. The genitalia were fake. And the dad, who I think was like a psychologist or like into things like that, science and stuff, thought it would be an interesting experiment to raise the girl as a boy and use the dog incident to explain why Frank has nothing down there. And this is interesting because, I mean, like, what a twist. But also, Frank had at times talked about how women are inferior because we're weaker than men and all of that stuff. So to actually find out that he is biologically female is interesting, but I do wish it had been built up to more. Like, looking back, it did come a bit out of nowhere. I can think of 2 hints, but one was just Frank mentioning being disabled without anything specific, so I wasn't quite sure what that was about. And the other thing was mentioning having to go to the loo while sitting down, which maybe other people might have picked up on, but I know men who sit down because less likely to splash, so that hint literally did not register. I didn't think that was weird. My issue with the ending is that it just didn't seem to sort of match anything. Like, it had all been about mental illnesses and Frank reading and reacting to the world in an almost fantastical manner, despite the world not being fantastical, with his rituals and the Wasp factory, which is just sort of a divination device of death. And then the twist that he was biologically female, it just didn't add anything. It just felt a twist for the sake of it, and it just wasn't satisfying in any way. That tied in with the revelation about Eric was also quite disappointing. I was expecting there to be like maybe like a switcheroo scenario or unreliable narration, or maybe like Frank had done all the terrible things and Eric had gotten blamed or something. It didn't feel like a very strong ending that really said anything or meant anything in either a plot way or a deep, meaningful thematic way. And looking back, it's just something slightly concerning about having a main character who is sort of trans, kind of, if unwittingly, being a psychopath who murders children and periodically kills and tortures wasps and other animals. And I don't know, just mixing that stuff kind of made me side-eye it a little bit. I didn't like what it could possibly have been accidentally implying about raising people as the sex they weren't assigned at birth without them being aware. I don't know. It was weird, and I wasn't sure about that, really. So yeah, I did enjoy most of this book. Up until the last few chapters, I was really invested. It is grim at times and has some pretty nasty elements, but it is enjoyable and gripping in this very like modern gothic sort of a way. It was only really the ending that let it down for me, which is a shame because I think the right ending that was sort of built up to effectively would have been really cool, but I don't know. I think Banks did try to build up to the twist, but it just wasn't very effective in my opinion. I guess I wouldn't not recommend this, as I did enjoy it, but I suppose I would just say be warned about some of the mental illnesses and how they're portrayed and talked about, because not all it seems accurate, but I'm not an expert and I could be way out of line. So it's down to the individual, I guess. And that's all I have to say about Mr. Banks. I have no more books of his, so I probably won't read him again. I won't seek him out because it's not my sort of stuff, but alas. So yeah, that's all I've got to say this time. Ciao.